Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to mention that when I do look around at my friends among aristocrats, tavern owners and shopkeepers alike, I do notice the most odd occurrence and peculiarity in that it seems that the firstborns generally are the more productive family members among all the brothers and sisters. Now, although this is not uniformly the case, it certainly seems the dominant pattern. And if we return to your 21st century, we find that our author today, Dr. Thomas Sowell, while born to a mother who already had a number of children, was raised from birth by his adoptive great-aunt and her two grown daughters, essentially as an only child. And this might partly explain, as we shall see, why this book, Discrimination and Disparities, is such a perfect antidote to the pseudo-scholarship of Ibram Kendi, whose How to Be an Anti-Racist I reviewed last week. Dr. Sowell, fellow at the Hoover Institution, ranks among the better free market economists and social theorists of our age, having written by my count over 50 books, among those on race being Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, Race and Economics, and Markets and Minorities. In this book, which I would give an A for its hard-hitting destruction of everything Ibram Kendi and his fellow CRT theorists represent, Sowell begins by directly attacking that very fallacy that Kendi constantly utilizes throughout, when he claimed that when outcomes in society are not racially equal or proportionate, they're indicative of discrimination, of racism. What Sowell instead shows is how overwhelmingly disparities in outcomes among individuals or racial or ethnic groups can be and are caused by hundreds of other factors. And he shows this by pointing out that oftentimes when one thing changes, the resulting change in performance of individuals or groups can be enormous, creating a disparity. So let's start by listing some examples of when one thing changes from the first third of his book. Number 1. From families with 5 children, firstborns won more National Merit Scholarships than second through fifthborns did combined. In addition, another study found that the number of firstborns in medical school was 10 times that of fourthborns. Which leads me to wonder where in his family's birth order Ibram Kendi was born. How might this relate to race relations? And Kendi's implication that all disparities are due either to racism or capitalism? Well, in the U.S., using figures for 2019 and 2020, blacks had 15.2% of U.S. births, with 12.5% of the population, and whites had 52.1% of births, with 60% of the population, meaning that blacks had 40% more children than whites, which would mean a lower percentage of firstborn children. Would Ibram Kendi ever dream of mentioning such naturally occurring disparities? Sowell notes that of the Jews, the most successful ethnic group by far the world has ever seen in modern times, access to Western universities started to open up in the late 19th century, at which point they started outperforming everyone. For example, comprising close to a third of various European student bodies, and from the period 1950 to 2000, won 22% of the Nobel Prizes in chemistry, 32% in medicine, and 32% in physics. And that with less than 16 million people worldwide. So what changed? Access to universities, creating huge disparities. Number 3, the Chinese, famously, were for millennia the most developed nation in the world, having invented paper, the printing press, the compass, gunpowder, silk, and even the umbrella, for which we British are profoundly grateful. But once their dictatorial rulers enforced an isolation from other countries, those other countries caught up and imposed their will on a vulnerable China, which declined to the status of a third world country. Sowell argues that with one crucial decision, the loss of just one prerequisite, they forfeited the country's preeminence in the world. So what changed again? The degree of isolation. It became much worse. Sowell points out that, on average, the less isolated the countries, regions, or even individuals are, the more knowledge and achievement they attain. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, it cost more to transport freight 100 miles inland than it did to transport it across the entire Mediterranean. And what were the practical results of that? Enormous social and geographical disparities. Thus, in classical antiquity, we find the superiority of the city of Rome connected to the nearby coast by the river Tiber. Athens, along the Aegean, Rhodes, Carthage, Marseille, the whole brilliant Minoan civilization on Crete earlier, Alexandria in Egypt, the Phoenicians at Tyre, and a veritable host of hundreds of cities stretching from Spain in the west all the way up into and around the Black Sea region. He notes that, generally speaking, before the arrival of modern communications, people who lived in the mountains tended to be the rednecks and country bumpkins. So, for example, the lowland Scots were a lot quicker than the highland Scots, and the people in Appalachia, the hillbillies, more backward than those suave, urbane city slickers found in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Incidentally, Kendi and other CRT theorists would have you believe that racism originated among whites in late medieval Europe. But the reality is that racism is just a form of collectivism, which views an individual as inferior just because he belongs to a different group. And collectivism has occurred since time immemorial. Sowell pointing out that, as late as the 10th century, a Muslim scholar noted the Europeans grew more pale the farther north you go, and also that the farther north they are to the north, the more stupid, gross, and brutish they are. How about that, Ibram? Muslims thought pale people inferior, way before modern capitalism, which Kendi blames for the origin of worldwide racism. Number 5. Yet another disparity mentioned, this cultural, occurs in the well-known fact that black students on average don't work as hard as white, which fact Kendi decries as racist. Asians, on the other hand, as the common stereotype says, work their little Asian butts off. In fact, in Australia, Asian students on average work twice as hard as Caucasian. How surprised should we be that Asian students in general tend to do better academically than white students in general in predominantly white societies such as Australia, Britain, or the United States? Sowell mentions that the same behavior that occurs among black teenagers in the United States of accusing smart kids of acting white occurs in my present England as well among poor whites, those who did well academically often being ostracized or even beaten up by other poor whites. Anyone want to bet me that that virtually never happens with Asian children and teenagers? So having covered all these numerous single factors which can radically create individual or group disparities, Sowell focuses next on the first part of his title, that of discrimination, quickly presenting a much more accurate understanding than Ibram Kendi managed in his entire book. Sowell gives us a tripartite typology: discrimination 1A, discrimination 1B, and discrimination 2. Let's start with discrimination 2, which, being pure bigotry, is easily disposed of. In other words, straight-up racism or sexism. More interesting are discriminations 1A and 1B. Discrimination 1A occurs when we have lots of time, energy, or money to get a great deal of knowledge about a person or object and can judge it individually, as when in dating we find a person who may be the one and spare no time or expense in getting to know them better. Discrimination 1B, however, occurs when for many different reasons we simply don't have that time, energy, or money, but instead need to use some attribute to make snap or collective decisions, which, however, can still be highly productive. So, as examples of 1B, he mentions in 19th century America, when both Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics came here. If an employer or a factory owner had decided to only employ one or the other group in a factory, but not both, that would be easily understandable. Discrimination 1B is also seen in wide-ranging situations, making it rational, for example, for UPS not to deliver or taxi cabs not to patronize violent neighborhoods, even though there are lots of good people living there, the unintended consequences for them being that they have to suffer for the actions of others in paying higher prices or in simply going without. But let us imagine, how would Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo respond if these violent neighborhoods having high prices were black? They'd say those higher prices were caused by discrimination 2, not 1B, racism. As Sowell relates the phenomenon of discrimination 1B with people quite rationally avoiding vast areas or groups of people because of their general qualities or reputation was very much recognized and feared by upstanding black Americans and their communities in the 20th century who lived in various cities before the Great Black Migration north. The influx of Southern blacks who were seen by both whites and Northern blacks as being uncouth, vulgar, and essentially country rowdies was understood not only to, as it eventually did, make their communities much more violent and unattractive, but also that Northern blacks would pay the price when others rationally engaged in discrimination 1B. And the same phenomenon happened as well on the West Coast. As Sowell concludes, in short, discrimination 1B had staying power, despite how much some might prefer depicting it as discrimination 2. Proceeding to his next section, Sowell then gives us numerous extended examples of how capitalism is the cure for racism. Are you listening, Ibram? Number 1. Sowell points out that even in extreme cases of discrimination 2, such as in the American South after the Civil War, research has shown that the wages earned there by blacks actually increased faster than that by whites. Yes, in the South, because labor markets were still competitive despite Southern racism. And so racist white farmers during harvesting, for example, who tried to lowball black workers were outbid by less racist white farmers. That is capitalism in action. And the same thing happened, believe it or not, in South Africa during apartheid, with widespread violations of apartheid laws by white employers and landlords in competitive industries. Dr. Sowell also mentions the same example that Dr. Richard Epstein did in his book Forbidden Grounds, which I reviewed here, where trolley car companies in the South at the end of the 19th century were actually highly resistant to segregating their cars because running two cars at the same time cost them lots of money, and segregation wasn't particularly desired by passengers either. That's right, a racist law by state governments, enacted by some racist legislators and voters, was needed to force the use of segregated trolley cars. In the same way, U.S. telephone companies employed hardly any blacks in the 1930s. Why? Because they were a government-regulated monopoly and so didn't have to respond to the desires of their consumers. Number 2, Sowell continues by pointing out that there were 300 black research chemists employed in private businesses in this earlier era, but only 3 black PhDs in any field employed by white universities. So the public nature of higher education in America, even before World War II, led to racism against blacks in higher education. Number 3, he points out how destructive minimum wage laws have been to black teenagers when they came into effect after 1950 and how black teen unemployment rates soared from then on. Why are minimum wage laws primarily so destructive for black and not white teenagers? Because they are a population most lacking in education, job skills, and experience. So with a minimum wage, the employer is prevented from trying that worker out. In addition, as Sowell points out, and Kendi ignores, discrimination against blacks has gotten less in the last 50 years, just as the black teenage unemployment rate has skyrocketed. Regarding also the counterproductive actions of governmental affirmative action bureaucracies, Sowell mentions the famous court case in which Sears was sued by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1979 for gender discrimination, even though the agency couldn't produce even one woman from any of Sears' hundreds of department stores around the country claiming to have been discriminated against. And even though Sears ultimately prevailed, the cost of justice was $20 million. And so most companies today just kowtow to the government by admitting a fictitious guilt. Similarly, companies know that if they check the criminal records of blacks, they may also be persecuted by the EEOC, like Sears was. And so instead they migrate their businesses away from concentrations of minority populations so that they will not be as legally vulnerable to costly charges of discrimination. A famous bogus charge of racial discrimination charged by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in 2000 saw black applicants for mortgages rejected at almost twice the rate of whites, 44 to 22%. However, on further investigation by one newspaper, it was found that 52% of blacks had credit scores so low that they would qualify only for the less desirable mortgages, which then explained the whole situation without recourse to institutional racism. In addition, people had ignored the fact that white applications were rejected much more than Asian applicants, with no one complaining on behalf of whites, only on behalf of blacks. Sowell, in the last third of the book, makes numerous other insightful points, such as how cutting tax rates on rich Americans, as happened in the 20s, from a high of 73% to a low of 24%, resulted in large increases in tax revenue. He mentions the decline in public order and civility starting in the West in the 1960s. And thirdly, how public housing has degenerated from what it previously was. Incidentally, Sowell criticizes linguist John McWhorter for trying to justify using black English in schools to teach ghetto youngsters. He pointing out that with no textbooks of virtually any subject in black English, you're condemning kids to an all-encompassing and destructive ignorance. Sowell contrasts McWhorter's advice with that of one large Japanese company, which simply orders all their employees to use English as their company's language in all foreign branches. He concludes that such policies as McWhorter advocates only result in a personal misfortune and a social tragedy. I would agree. On that note of heightened intellectual pleasure that invariably accompanies reading Dr. Sowell, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.